Okay, so we're starting in the middle of a conversation here, but we're just going to dive in, and then we'll circle back to who is the Richard Beck. But you were just saying, you were talking about the public space, the online space for theological reflection by theologians, which we're going to have to talk about you being in that space too. I mean, that's part of the fascination that I have with your writing career. But you were noting that it's like undervalued in terms of the way academics are evaluated for like tenure and promotion purposes.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what were you were saying? It
Yeah,
shouldn't be. Why should blogging? Let's call it. Use the ugly blog. Why should that count in terms of academic career?
Yeah, I think in the early years of blogging, but now with podcasting and then like the Substack newsletter happening, that in the early years when I started writing in 2007, that writing online was nothing considered was considered to be nothing for a tenure promotion portfolio. But I think over time, almost 20 years later, I think most theologians realize that they have a greater impact on the church and on the theological conversation if they engage with social media.
Yeah.
And there is even a peer review aspect to it. Like you'll see pretty academic scholarship get published, and that person will then kind of make the rounds of theology podcasts, and then people will react on Substacks or on blogs to that. So that, I mean, they are not escaping a peer review process,
right?
By going public. In fact, it's more pretty rigorous than you would find in a conference. And so I do think a lot of theologians have started realizing, listen, if I want my theology to be read, I could publish it in a journal and maybe 5 people will read it. But if I do a podcast or I write a Substack, hundreds, if not thousands of people will engage with this work. It'll have a broad influence, not just on other theologians who come across that work and go read it, but also on the church. And yet, I think higher ed is lagging behind universities in recognizing all of that work as intellectual work, as peer-reviewed work that can be included on like a tenure promotion portfolio. So like I've been through that process, and I didn't put any of my online stuff on, but that's, if any reputation I have in a theological conversation or even among psychologists is wholly because of my online work.
Yeah.
So yeah, I do think we got to figure out a way to evaluate that. There's got to be a way to do that. But yeah, I think it's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, I happen to be on the tenure and promotion committee for our department because they wanted, as soon as I came on full time, they were like, hey, we would like somebody who is going through this process to be on the committee. So it seemed like a useful thing to do. And this is actually part of the conversation, is like we're trying to figure out how to almost like weight things that are non-traditional in terms of scholarship relative to the things that the big T&P committee, the university level T&P committee, is looking for, because we have, all the departments have these intermediary documents where we kind of interpret what the faculty handbook says, what it means for our department, and what kinds of things count as scholarship or whatever else. And so, yeah, it's really interesting because we are kind of in a moment where the way that scholars interface with the church, as you say, is changing, and at least some of that is unprecedented. In terms of media, I don't know how unprecedented it is in terms of like asking the question 40 years ago. Well, what does my weekend preaching have to do with, is that just service or does the fact that I'm studying and some of this stuff will end up in a commentary, et cetera, what does that have to do with, so yeah, it's an interesting dilemma, but you would, I'm assuming in your portfolio include the books that you've written that are not on experimental psychology.
Yeah.
So there's already a right. There's already a like.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a popularizing thing. This is not lab research. This is an explanation, an act of public intellectual, right, presentation that is valuable, and that there's a recognition that that's valuable. So it's almost just an extension of that same thing, right?
No, I agree. I do think popular level writing, especially if it's crossing disciplinary boundaries or like wholly outside of disciplinary boundaries, is very difficult to classify.
Yeah.
I'm lucky to be at a university where I think any productivity is considered a good thing that helps the visibility of the institution. But yeah, I think if I was in a secular tier one research university where I was, my vocational identification was wholly as an experimental psychologist, yeah, almost all of my writing would be considered like illegitimate and out of bounds.
Yeah.
I would need to be writing and publishing empirical research, and I did that. You know, I mean, when I got to ACU, I was very much like, my identity was like an empirical psychologist, research psychologist, and I published journal articles and all that stuff.
That's where it belongs, and it goes in journals. It doesn't go in books most of the time. So yeah.
The other thing I'd say, going back, kind of looping back to the T&P thing, here would be my idea for you to pitch to those conversations. Is that I do think under scholarship and it may be service. I don't know where it goes, but like the category of public intellectual, I think used to be a robust category, and I think it's returning. And I think there needs to be a place where you could say, as a public intellectual, here is my popular writing, my podcasting, my Substack, and there are metrics of success there, of impact, but also quality. One could have people write, letters, or people that follow who are academics, and kind of saying, yeah, this is not just Joe Rogan talk, just shooting the breeze with some dudes or whatever like that. But this is theology for the church, theology for the public. So I think we need to recover a public intellectual heading in T&P, so that people can at least show it. I don't know how much you'd weight it, but the work people are putting in needs to be recognized.
I agree. Yeah, I agree. And I've been thinking about the public intellectual category for a few years, just trying to think about. Yeah, I've written a bunch on the Substack about the relationship between the church and the academy, and just that bridging that is so challenging for historical reasons, but it's also just the fact that, as you say, the public intellectual, and which has always been essentially a translator of higher level academic, if you like, thinking to a wider audience, and that space in the culture, and therefore also in the church, just shrunk, and there wasn't really a lot of people doing that work. And so even in, I don't know if you've ever looked at Brad East's breakdown of the four tiers of publishing that kind of runs from like John Mark Comer style all the way to dissertation style.
Yeah.
And there's just not a lot in the middle space. It's like either very, very, I'll just generously call it accessible, or it's just hard to understand. And so living in that middle space is maybe as you say, more and more of that's happening, but it's challenging to cross that divide.
Yeah.
So your work has done that some, I think. But I'm really curious. So let's back up. You said experimental psychologist. You're the chair of the Department of which department? What's the name?
Psychology.
Just psychology. Okay, I didn't know if it was
Department of Psychology.
more than one thing together. Yeah, Department of Psychology. But I know you from back in the day because you were blogging on theology. And I was like, wait a second. And B, because you published some books that caught church people's attention, right? You published on, which, tell me if this is right. I feel like your first book, Unclean, was really steeped in the empirical research You were sort of bringing to bear some of those psychological frameworks in a pretty direct way, but on kind of church stuff and the way that the church struggles with being close to things that trigger disgust reactions and so on, socially speaking. And but then you kept writing and kept going and got into other stuff that's just very theological. So how did that happen? What's the story here?
Slow drift, probably. Yeah. Well, I think one thing that's maybe helpful to understand in the background was my undergraduate degree was in Christian ministry, and so my foundational years, I was thinking about theology, biblical studies, maybe ministry, maybe philosophy, but more like philosophy, religion. So I actually thought about going to grad school in philosophy. And so that's some of my roots. Then in graduate school, I pivoted to my training in psychology, and there I kind of got the research bug, and in my master's and my doctoral training. And so most of my early research, when I got that research bug, was empirical research in clinical psychology, mental health issues. And so that was my first probably decade worth of publishing. But then I have a kind of, I get bored real easy, and I like to kick around like conceptual things. I like big ideas, and so. But in I just quickly discovered in the clinical research world there wasn't a lot of theoretical innovation going on.
Yeah,
and it was more refining things that already, better assessment instruments. It was very cognitive behavioral. And once you kind of mastered all of that, I was kind of like, okay, good. And I was just starting to get a little intellectually restless. So about 10 years in, I started looking. Plus, it was also harder to do that research at ACU because we don't have a big inpatient clinical training facility where I can do a lot of clinical research. So you're still trying to do mental health research on college students who are obviously deeply unwell, but don't necessarily meet like clinical diagnostic levels to get into the very best journals. So I was getting intellectually bored and also struggling to get through the peer review process with just undergraduate samples, trying to do research on like depression, anxiety. So I was like, okay, well, what do I turn to now, empirically speaking? And I looked around my campus and I go, who do I have a lot of access to? Well, a lot of religious people. And so I thought, let me pivot into psychology of religion. And the interesting thing about psychology of religion is it was pretty wide open. There was a lot more theoretical freedom that one could explore. And I had easy access to undergraduate students who were religious and can do that kind of research. So I started publishing in psychology of religion. And then I got an invitation, and some of that research was on the relation of disgust and purity psychology on religious behavior. And some of it, like you mentioned, was about obviously treating people who are deemed unclean, right? The moral lepers of society. But another part of that book was on the body, kind of that Gnostic strain that runs through Christianity, where the body is considered to be unclean and icky. And so our ambivalence about the incarnation and our own embodiment and the flight from the body into kind of an over-spiritualized or Platonic kind of Christianity. So I just found some fascinating intersections there between this empirical line of research on disgust psychology with all of these things going on in Christian moral practice and the Christian experience with embodiment. And so wrote an article about that and got an invite to write my first book doing that integration stuff. And so that began a kind of my career of trying to take really interesting theological ideas like Gnosticism or impurity psychology. Like purity psychology blew up after I wrote my book in the evangelical space, and kind of connect those things we're seeing in religious populations with psychological science and theory. But then, after I wrote kind of 3 books that were more academic along that. I got an invitation to write a popular level book for a general audience that was just very spirituality, Christianity forward. And so I'm always writing as a psychologist.
Yes.
But those books became very faith forward. And I get often mistaken as a theologian. People describe me as a theologian, but that's not my training. And any theological expertise has been me playing catch up. Now, I was able to rely on my undergraduate training.
Yes.
So I'm not beginning at ground zero, where a lot of psychologists would have no exposure at all to hermeneutics or exegesis or church history.
Yeah.
And so for me, it was kind of a coming back home in a sense. Yeah.
Yeah, and clearly you have leveled a ton over the years. I mean, it's interesting. You go, well, I'm not a theologian, and we play this credentialing game or whatever. But it's like, I mean, you've got a graduate level education just by virtue of what you've decided to read and think about and write about, and so it's interesting, like what counts.
Yeah.
There's all of that at stake. But no, I mean, I think you're certainly writing theology for the church, and stuff that I don't know. I kind of get jealous sometimes when I'm reading someone who just clearly has their finger on the pulse of something, and I guess that's part of the benefit of being a psychologist, is kind of understanding where people are at the moment or whatever. But you go like, man, that's so. Just I'll give you an example. I mean, you know how well your books have done, and many listeners will already be familiar with you. But the winter Christian thing that you kind of presented, and you've worked a lot in kind of the deconstruction space and reconstruction, and so on. But it was just comical to me presenting that as a part of a sermon, right? And just sort of opening up the conversation about lament and, looking at some practices and so on. And so I just kind of framed this out and go, okay, this is Richard Beck. He's a psychologist, and he, proposes this category of winter Christian. And like all of these sad sacks in the church, I'm joking. I'm a winter Christian also. But they just perk up. And they're like, wait, there's a category for me. I didn't even know that I was allowed to be. And so it's that kind of stuff, which isn't something that a theologian necessarily is going to come up with. I mean, it's the interdisciplinarity of your work, in other words, is what I'm praising here. I think it's really, really helpful, and just proves, as like reading a couple of your articles this morning, he's just thinking about this from an angle. He's thinking about the same things, but from an angle I would never have thought of, right? And that is just so useful. So I'm glad that you got bored and went back to your roots, as you say.
Yeah. One of the things I think, a big influence on me has been so the origin story of me kind of getting into psychology of religion, because again, this was a completely open field to me. I was like, I didn't know anything about it really. So I literally over a Christmas break, I was like, let's begin at the beginning. And so I read William James's The Varieties of Religious Experience. And for listeners who don't know that James or that book, that is kind of like the ground zero of psychology of religion, because James was the first one in his Guilford lectures to kind of like look at religion through the eyes of a psychologist. And he adopts a very kind of pragmatic approach where he's not weighing in. And I think this is where more my approach is maybe different, is that he's like, let's set aside the metaphysical contents here and adjudicating between them. And I think that's where most people, when they think about religion, they're typically at the metaphysical level of belief. What do people believe? What are the creeds? What are the, what's the axioms, the propositions, and which ones are right, which ones are wrong? And we police the heretical versus the orthodox. And so we're dealing with intellectual systems. But James is like, let's set all that aside and let's just ask, what impact does that have upon a person? And he's pretty open. He's like, some of these impacts are good, and some of these impacts are not very healthy. And so that's kind of where I think I surprise people, because I'm like, I'm not going to be overly invested in who's right or versus wrong, but I am interested in, like, if people believe X, how does that affect their experience of God? And in good ways and in bad ways. And so, like, just last night I was watching a cult documentary. Man, I am a sucker for a cult documentary. But that's a huge area of psych religion research, is like, how does that happen?
Yeah.
What defines a cult? What's the psychological experience? There's always at the heart of a cult, where people get pulled into it, like an existential longing, you know? So there is this thirst or this hunger that makes them very vulnerable to it. And that's always like episode 1. You know, I love this community and I felt seen. And you're like, oh, it's not going to go well, you know? But to me, beginning with that kind of human need and response and how theology affects us is to me kind of where I think I kind of approach things a little differently, where I think my sense of watching theologians and biblical scholars from afar is that you are trained all in very top-down kind of systems. So much so there are like schools. Like if you go to a certain school, that school has a reputation for being Hauerwasian or Bardian, or it's classical theology or patristics, and or it's scholastic Aquinas or whatever. Like you go there and you kind of get taught in a system, and then you go off to your conferences to do combat with all these other systems, and you learn the standard characterizations and put downs. And same with Pauline scholars, the apocalyptic school or the new perspective, or the Paul within Judaism school. So even within that, you learn the standard kinds of things, where I kind of look at a person in the pew going like, you know, if they believe X, you know, how does it affect them morally? How do they treat outsiders? How does it affect their level of guilt or shame? Are they anxious? Are they contented? You know, I kind of, that's where I kind of start kind of thinking about it, is like, you know, you can believe anything you want. I just am interested in what the impact of that belief has upon you.
Yeah. Can you believe anything you want?
Well, I mean, so that's a whole other story there. I don't. I mean, in one sense, if I'm putting on my psychology hat, I'm saying I'm not going to judge the contents of your mind, but I can ask how it affects you. You know, but when I take off my psychology hat and ask about faith, then obviously I do have some investments in truth claims. So I don't want to be wholly relativistic. I'm just talking about how I might begin a conversation about faith. And like just today, I was writing a series about the classic Calvinistic Arminian fight about once saved, always saved, you know, and or the perseverance of the saints, you know, and so typically a theologian will argue from those top-down propositions and try to adjudicate who's right. Can you fall from grace or not? And it becomes kind of a zero-sum game between different competing, you know, axioms. So when I was writing that, I was saying, although I grew up in an Arminian tradition, for those listeners who don't know, like free will and you can actually fall from grace. I said, but the experience of that growing up in the Churches of Christ was very anxiety inducing. You know, that I felt like the line separating saved and lost was a line I was walking. You know, I was going back and forth over that line multiple times a day. Yeah. And I would, you know, if you sinned, you'd feel guilty until you repented and confessed, then you move back over to the saved line. And thus, so here's my point in bringing that up. The experience of that theology was very anxious. And because salvation was very provisional and fragile. So that's an example of like, if I have a method, the method is like, set aside who's right, Arminians or Calvinists. That theology created in me a very anxious, experience. And so let's begin with that anxiety. What's going on in the mind? And then can that experience, and this is where things might get a little controversial with my work, is can that experience of anxiety be taken as theological data? Okay.
Yeah.
If a theology is deemed to be right, but it's causing anxiety and guilt, can that anxiety and guilt be introduced as data that maybe the theology is wrong? The problem with that is that you're starting to use the human experience as like the defining criterion. And at this point, Hauerwas and the Bardians are going to get very upset with me, because it's a very liberal, progressive thing to say, is to insert the human experience as a big piece of the footprint of theological data. And so I'm very alert to the concerns there.
Yeah.
But I do think the human experience should be taken as its impact upon people, not just in anxiety or confidence, but also in its moral outworking.
Yeah.
How we treat other people.
So it's interesting that you say should, because you're responding to a pre-existing sort of shouldn't. But the way that I came into contact with James was through studying philosophical pragmatism, and he was sort of there at the beginning and one of the major thinkers there. And so I came in the back door on the religious phenomenology stuff, but I was more focused on the pragmatism and have really embraced some of the implications of that, and so I would say the comical thing about the should and shouldn't is that it ignores just the is. The experience is theological data.
Yeah.
Full stop. There's no avoiding it. There's nothing you can do about it. And so to me, it's valuable to have someone who is able to then critically examine, again, the phenomena that arise out of religious experience, because it's not there is no necessary sequence of experiences and conclusions. It's talking to everything else in the theological system. Your experience is, and so I'm sort of like, well, whatever. Like, you can object that we should be objective here, and that our experience shouldn't play this role, but I'm sorry, it does. And so now what I want to know is, okay, so what's happening, and just keep doing that as the conversation progresses. For example, if we go back to the purity conversation, and the reason that blew up in evangelicalism was in large part because of so-called purity culture, and that's all about sex stuff rather than disgust stuff per se. But you have what you can observe factually is that blowing up is about people saying, my experience of this teaching about sexuality affected my relationship with God and the church, etc. And so on. It just did. That's the case. And so I want to open that up, and then I also want to go, okay, and also your experience or your children's experience of rejecting purity culture is also doing some things. Can we talk about what that's doing as well? The pragmatism I find very helpful, and I don't know if that makes me a bad theologian, but that's just sort of how my mind works.
I guess practical theology is a part of that, And you're right. It's there are some swings back and forth, like for example, soon after, right at the very beginning of the wave of what we would consider kind of woke culture, and I don't mean that pejoratively. I think biblically, I have very much strong social justice concerns, but
likewise,
but but in the beginning of that era, I wrote this post called "The Purity Culture of Progressive Christianity," and how it has its own. Where the evangelical purity culture was about sexuality, mainly young female sexuality being pure, but in the early days of what we consider kind of the woke culture, it has its own form of purity culture, and it's driven, but it's driven by the same logics, different criteria, but the same logic of trying to, through moral performance, we'd call that virtue signaling and other sorts of behaviors, to try to maintain a pure posture in relation to all the right social justice issues, and to trying to stand pure and uncontaminated. But then that creates that kind of left wing posture of kind of always calling out compromises and complicity.
Yeah, it's puritanical. Yeah. I mean, you brand people with scarlet letter and all of that.
Yeah, exactly. It's very similar. So and the point of unclean is that, like, that's unavoidable because humans naturally reason about right or wrong in the idiom of dirt and pollution. And that's across cultures. So if you're conservative or a liberal, you're still going to be importing in a certain kind of psychology that will begin creating kind of mental biases. Your moral hygiene will take on a distinctive partisan character, but the underlying psychology of maintaining moral purity is the same. And so you're right about that. Just when you think to your, you've dealt with one experiential issue to the left, you got another one on your right, and back and forth about all that.
Yeah. Which, speaking of which, there may not be much here. I'm just curious because I've thought about this for a while. It was back in 2021-ish, the New York Times published a big piece on purity culture, and at that time, there were a whole bunch of evangelical celebrities kind of going this way and that way on the conversation. But most recently, with Jen Hatmaker sort of coming out against her background in the purity culture stuff, the conversation has resurfaced with people in my life who are feeling frustrated with her in some way, and it raises for me again this question that I've wondered, and then I'm wondering if you have thought about this, if you have anything to say about the fact that women who are the same age and were raised in the same purity culture, if not the exact same church, have such radically different experiences of what that did, because the narrative is about, like, this is what purity culture did to these young women or whatever, but like, my wife was raised in this too, and she's like, I don't know what everybody, and I know plenty of other women who are raised in conservative traditions and churches where and all of the things, and they just don't have the same existential angst about it, and so I'm curious how you parse the evidence there. Like, what is that?
Well, I mean, so I'm a psychologist, which means we're studying human thought and behavior, and my first gloss about all that is everything's an interaction effect. And what I mean by an interaction effect is I think a lot of us think, because our minds are like this, that humans are dominoes. And here's a cause, there's an effect, and so if this domino falls, this other domino will fall.
You're a determinist. I get it.
Yeah. That's where. No. I'm pushing against that. But what I'm saying is, I think our models of like why something, like our models of human psychology in the world tend to be very, A causes B, and thus, like you're describing, here's purity culture. It inevitably leads to guilt, shame, But to your point, not always. And so the question is, well, why not? If that domino falls, if I was raised in a conservative culture, why didn't I have all these effects? You know, and the other thing, you know, because I read with my wife, we listened to it on an audiobook, the Jen Hatmaker memoir that everybody's talking about.
Yeah.
And I had some odd responses to that, the way she kind of laid her development on that domino.
Yeah.
Because from what I can tell, she has this really great relationship with her parents and tells these lovely experiences about being raised in that culture. And I'm like, so I don't know if even her telling of that story is completely transparent to her, because clearly the parents that took her to that church that espouse that theology don't come in for the same criticism. The church does, but not her parents. And so clearly that wasn't an unmitigated, that wasn't a complete disaster in her life or whatever. So I do think it can be kind of an easy, but I want to be clear. I also think the narratives of harm and damage are real and true and can be decidedly horrific.
I was just about to add this similarly. I don't intend the observation that people have different experiences of purity culture to somehow minimize the bad experiences that people are sharing. Like, how much is enough? At what point do you have to go like, well, okay, so it's not 100%, but is 10% enough? Is 50% enough? It's a lot. It's a lot of people that are having a bad experience here.
and so it's hard to know. I mean, it would be interesting to get some like longitudinal data on that kind of, and maybe studies have been published about all that. But to come back to my point about an interaction effect is that the intersection of purity culture with particular individuals doesn't create a straight line domino falling. It interacts and it creates an explosion of very different outcomes depending on what do we mean by purity culture. So, for example, if you were raised in any Christian, Protestant tradition, you were raised in purity culture, right? Let me be clear about that. Like even if you're a Protestant, you were raised in purity culture because the expectation was you would not have sex before marriage. Right. So in that sense, the entire ethic is purity culture. Okay. But if you mean by purity culture, not just kind of the expectation that adolescents should delay, right, sexual intercourse.
Activity, yeah.
Yeah. To something more guilt-driven, where the females felt especially spotlighted and singled out. And like, okay, so right there's a continuum, of what we mean by purity culture. Secondly, it's going to be mediated through the relationships ones have with their parents, and their church. So I was raised in the Church of Christ, conservative, but I had really good parents. And so even though there might have been doctrines, not just purity culture doctrines, but doctrines about hell or judgment or things like that were obviously kind of in the background of my mind, but those were always filtered through the affectional experience I had with my parents.
Exactly. This is what I mean by everything else in the theological system is input. Yeah.
And then lastly, there's my relationship with my church. Like, did I feel connected to my people? Did I love them? Did I feel loved by them? And so those are all part of what I'd throw in there as the interaction effect. What do you exactly mean by purity culture? Are you talking about just the standard traditional Christian sexual ethic? Are you talking about something that was very shaming and guilt driven in sermons preached or whatever? And then there's going to be I'm very hesitant to say this, just kind of the general neuroticism of the person, our propensity to shame and guilt.
Yes.
And some of us are so when that all interacts, when I have a propensity towards shame and guilt, and then I have a theology that accentuates shame and guilt, and then I have very controlling parents, and all of that can then create a storm of problems.
Yeah.
But if some of those variables are not in play, then you have a very different outcome.
Yeah.
And so all that to say is it's really complex. And so the domino theory of purity culture explains a piece of what's going on, but I think there's a lot more complexity there, as there is with any sort of theological interface, church. So you got church, theology, parental, our own personalities that we bring into the thing, and then our unique experiences with sex. As just everybody has a very different sexual history. Throw all that in the stew, that has an outcome. Very hard to predict in any accurate way how that plays out.
Yeah. Man, that's really good. That's really good. So back to the question. I don't want to say this. I'm thinking of my colleague in the Bible department, Chris Flanders' work on shame from a cultural, anthropological perspective, and thinking that part of the issue here is what seems to be, and maybe this is part of what you meant by the sort of progressive ethos or whatever, what's running in the background of this kind of cultural theological operating system that determines the nature of the question itself. Like, is the experience of guilt or shame theological data? Is the presumption that guilt and shame are bad, and that we're not supposed to feel that, like that's a negative emotion.
Yeah.
We're not, and I'm thinking of Chris's work because he's sort of trying to rehabilitate shame as having redemptive potential, like, and I think that's a huge part of the difference of experience between generations. And I don't know exactly where the break is historically for us, but I think that whereas earlier generations experienced the same kind of, call it puritanical if you want, but just like strict sexual ethics with consequences attached, like moral consequences attached, it was like how they experienced that was very much about the presumption that I should feel guilt and shame if I do something that I believe actually God doesn't like. And that applies to many things, not just sex, right? I should feel that. It's fine to feel that if I do the wrong thing. Yeah. And there seems to be, like, just increasingly driving this conversation, this post-evangelical conversation about purity culture, a presumption that if you find guilt and shame, that's a pretty strong indication that your theology's bad. And I just don't know that works. I'm struggling with that from multiple perspectives, not only historically, but also anthropologically and so on. I don't know.
No, I would agree with that. I mean, from just a basic observation about moral psychology, like those moral, so what we're talking about here is like moral emotions, right? Guilt, shame, moral outrage, indignation, right? These are all regulating our moral system, and they're there because they're there for a reason, right? Guilt is not inherently maladaptive. It exists because it is inherently adaptive. Shame as well. And you even see that in Brene Brown. She has this famous distinction between guilt and shame. Now, I disagree with her on this, but she says, guilt is I have done something wrong, and again, that guilt is for me to take moral responsibility. If I break it, I need to fix it.
Yeah,
and I think all progressive people who progressive Christians who've been a little bit worried about guilt and shame, given their social justice proclivities, feel like people who break things in the world, should fix them.
That's right.
So to be very clear, the progressive person, and again, I lean more on that side, it's a very moralized worldview.
Yes.
I mean, it's not devoid of moral content. It is almost inherently a moral worldview, defined by its moral urgency.
Yeah.
In concerns for justice. So they wouldn't want to eliminate guilt ever.
No.
In fact, they're very keen to point out who the guilty are currently, And what's interesting is that then Brene Brown describes shame as that I am bad. Now, this is where Chris Flanders, I think, would disagree with Brown, because that has never been the sociological definition of shame, the feeling that I am bad. Shame has always been, as Chris will tell you, a social emotion. Shame is experiencing the group's disapprobation, right? Yeah. I have shamed my family. I have, brought shame upon myself in the eyes of the culture. And what's interesting about progressives is they believe in that too, right? A large part of what cancel culture was bringing social shame.
That's ritual shaming. Yeah, that's exactly
to bear upon it. So even they recognize the moral and the social utility of those emotions. We need guilt. And we need shame. The problem, they would argue, is these people don't feel guilt for breaking the world, and they are shameless in breaking the world. So yes, I agree with your point and Chris's point, in that we need to rehabilitate those. So what is that thing that Brene Brown was trying to describe? That internalized shame, where I begin feeling that I am damaged goods, unforgivable, God is against me. So that is a curdling of shame and guilt into something that is dysfunctional. And to be clear, that needs to be a pressing pastoral concern. But I do think, as you're describing, a lot of our theological lives tend to be very, I will use the word as a psychologist, Oedipal, from a Freudian perspective. We're always reacting Oedipally towards our origin stories. And so you'll see people raised in evangelicalism become ex-evangelical, and therefore their theology is completely devoted to like what they're against. So any sort of shame or guilt is considered to be problematic,
and shame on you if you cause it.
Because you're in an Oedipal, so your theological reflections are really not being holistic or comprehensive. You're still in an Oedipal posture. You're still healing from your past wounds.
Still
and I
killing
get
dad.
it. Yeah, and I get it. I get you might need a season where you sit in a space and nobody judges you, right? Like nobody talks about sin or hell. Like I get you might need to sit in a space for a season to heal up some of those wounds. But then I think if you mature past those, then at some point you're going to come back to the question of shame and guilt, because as we've just pointed out, everybody believes in it. And there's a name for people that have no guilt or shame, and we call them sociopaths.
That's right.
Like to have any sensitive moral conscience, you're going to have those kinds of things.
That's right.
So I agree with you.
Yeah. Interesting analogy. I don't know if I've just missed you saying this before. It sounds like something you've probably said before. But so is that your, as far as deconstruction, is the Oedipal narrative kind of your primary way of thinking about what that is?
The deconstruction?
Yeah, the deconstruction sort of vogue in the last 20 years. Is that Oedipal essentially in your mind?
It's a piece. Yeah, I think it's a piece of it. I think deconstruction comes from like different sources. So for some people, if you look at like a Rachel Held Evans, I don't know if your listeners know her, but she was like a big voice in the early years of blogging, tragically passed away. And I knew Rachel. But if you look at her journey, it was primarily like hermeneutical and scientific. Like she was being triggered by like, how do you make science reconcile with the Bible? And so she was deconstructing things. Like her first book called Evolving in Monkeytown was really about her, so some of us deconstruct for intellectual reasons. but some of us are deconstructing because of toxic upbringings that you're talking, you're describing about. So it's triggered by church abuse or familial abuse, and I'm deconstructing. Some of it's strictly, so there might be a colder and a hotter version. Some of us can be coldly intellectual as we deconstruct. That was my story. I deconstructed not because I had lovely parents and I love my church.
Intellectual
I don't-
honesty. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have any bad stories about that upbringing.
Yeah.
But to me, I'm a thinker, and the puzzle pieces weren't fitting together that I was raised in. So mine was a colder, more intellectual deconstruction. Some people have been abused and hurt, and so that deconstruction is a lot hotter and emotional.
Yeah.
I think some of it was political. I think some people were reacting to the way the church had seemed to become very involved in partisan politics. And so some of it was they were on a political journey. They were maybe raised conservative and they were journeying towards a more progressive view on gender issues. That was Rachel's early one, egalitarianism, her year of biblical womanhood. So some of it had to do with like justice issues, political issues. So I'd say those are your three main, and some of us have braided. I guess, and then the fourth one would be, although this might be part of the intellectual one, is like the problem of evil. People are just. So I think there's a philosophical, theological deconstruction. There's this kind of political deconstruction where they were kind of moving from Republican to Democrat, or having more social justice inflected politics. Somebody like a Shane Claiborne, is a good example of that. Raised evangelical, got involved in justice politics, goes on his journey. And some it's more of a reacting to a church abuse,
Right.
high control environment, or a little bit of all those things.
Well, I think that fourth one's really significant though, because I don't think that is just about intellectual. The problem of evil is almost always for everyone deeply emotional and existential.
Yeah.
It's not the problem that modernity and the Enlightenment created. It's the problem that's existed since Job, right? I mean, it's And so, man, but that's really interesting. I've never seen like a taxonomy of reasons for or kinds of deconstruction. That strikes me as an interesting article that you should.
Yeah, at some point,
Yeah.
I think it's
really,
all braided.
because
It's all braided together too. I think
it
for
is,
many
but I mean, I
people.
think as you say, like if ever I was in a deconstruction mode, which would have been very mild in my story, it would be purely intellectual, just nothing to do with, and then dealing with the problem of evil, not. I guess that's when it becomes intellectual, when it's like you're not in a life crisis of any kind yourself. You're just sort of looking at the conversation that people are having about it,
Yeah.
But everybody feels the question, if God is good, how can this be, right? I mean, everybody feels that if they believe in God. Anyway, I think that's really actually helpful for an off-the-cuff reaction to
I've been thinking about this stuff for a long time, so not completely off the cuff. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. So look, I am wearing my Johnny Cash shirt for you.
Yeah. There you go.
Yeah, man. You might have seen your book over here in the background. It's
I
always
noticed that.
there. I didn't put it up for you. I'm not trying to flatter you
All right.
superficially. Just be flattered that that's a permanent part of the background there.
I am flattered. Yeah.
We're a Johnny Cash family over here, and whenever that book dropped, I was so excited, and then it showed up in my Christmas stocking that year. So,
there you go.
yeah, so it was great. But would you just recall a little bit why in the world you wrote a book on Johnny Cash that's about half theology and half like pay-in to his cultural moment?
Yeah. So, going back to the first part of this conversation, like books out of the box. So it's one thing for me to write about theology. It's another thing for an experimental psychologist, who writes a book about a country music star. Like how does that fit in your academic resume?
Yeah, when I was like, all right, Beck's just doing whatever he wants now, clearly, which I admire.
Yeah.
So I was like, this is great.
Yeah. So the story was, and then some of this goes back to the deconstruction. So I again went through a long season of deconstruction. I would describe myself for about 20 years of my life, from 20 to 40, as a Christian agnostic. And by that I mean Christian in practice and commitment. Never stopped going to church. Continued to be involved in ministries. But if you really push me on the metaphysics, is any of this true? I'd be like, I don't really know. But you got.
So you were honest. You were, unlike so many people.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to decide. But I have to decide somehow how you want to live and invest your life.
Yeah.
And so I would have considered myself a disciple, a follower of Jesus.
Yeah.
Anyway, but a large part of my Reconstruction journey was prison ministry. Mm-hmm. So I'm a prison chaplain at a maximum security unit in my hometown, and that became a really important season of Reconstruction. I'd say even decisive. And anyway, in the early years of prison ministry, I came across this in a bargain CD bin, Cash's live at Folsom Prison, and I wouldn't have said I was a Cash fan at that time. I like people know things about Elvis. I mean, he is just a part of the American.
Yeah.
People know a little bit about Dolly Parton. They know a little bit. A little bit. That's where I was. But I thought, oh man, this would be kind of cool. I'll listen to this CD on the drive out to the unit, which is about 20 minutes. So I just began listening to Live at Folsom Prison,
Which is the record, man. It's the record.
And it's what everybody says it is.
Yeah.
Absolutely amazing, unforgettable, unprecedented, and it's because of it's live. You're hearing the inmates screaming, the applause. You hear they boo the warden.
Oh yeah.
You hear the numbers called out for visitation, prisoner.
Criticizes the water.
Yeah, I mean
it's great.
Yeah, and it was so that was like my conversion experience, my Damascus Road experience with Johnny Cash. And there was just something about listening to the album as I'm walking into a prison. I'm literally I pull into the prison parking lot, I'm listening to it, I turn it off, and I'm walking through barbed wire, and spending time with inmates. I'm coming out of that experience, putting it back in, and there was something about that juxtaposition that, and then right around that time, I think it's Hilburn. The Hilburn biography came out, which is considered to be kind of like one of the definitive biographies of Cash. So I got it, read it, and then as I read through his life, I'm a very obsessive person. And so every time I got to kind of an album at his life, I would go get that album. Mm-hmm. So as I'd read the biography, I just listened to his entire discography, and just kept getting struck by the pervasive Christianity in his story and what I felt he was always trying to do with his music.
Yeah.
And as most people would know, as the Man in Black, right? He was kind of an outlaw figure. So he's always been attracted, kind of that outlaw image of Cash. There's a famous picture of him flipping off the camera at the San Quentin concert. But he was always speaking up for the downtrodden, the marginalized, and the little guy. And I thought, that's the gospel.
Yeah.
To kind of stand in solidarity with the margins. He always kind of did that in very interesting ways. And so I thought maybe I could pull that together into a book, kind of take everything I've been so it was kind of like part musical history, walking through his albums, and how and his struggles with faith, because obviously a part of the other story there is a story of grace given his lifelong drug addiction. So there's the standing up for the marginalized, grace for the sinner himself being an addict, and then my own experiences in prison ministry. Those are the three braids that came together as the book. I was really proud of that book. I'm not saying it's perfect, but when I said yes to it as an idea, I quickly realized that it was going to be a really hard book to write because if you write about Johnny Cash, you're writing about somebody who's been written about a lot.
Yeah.
And his fans know the story pretty well.
Yeah.
So you're trying to write a book that's going to be accessible to the person that knows nothing about Cash, but you also know there's going to be some hardcore fans who are going to pick up the book, and they need to be satisfied too.
Yeah.
And that required a depth of learning about his story in a way that I wasn't prepared for. The biographical aspect of that, being a biographer of his story. But I did the best I could.
That's interesting because my experience was that the burden of the book for people who are familiar with Cash was to put into words what to do with Cash, right? What to make of him, theologically, right? I mean, you know, which is what you pulled off, and I think, you know, I looked at some reviews of the book and stuff, and some people were like puzzled, like, what is this? What? It's like this in between thing, right? And it's like, yeah, that's the point. Is you don't need somebody to tell the story again. You need somebody to make something of it. And I mean, I love it. I thought you did a really great job doing that.
And he's a bit of a, I mean, he was an artist, like not a theologian, so he's a bit of a Rorschach blot. And so you know, people can impose upon his music different sorts of meaning. So it's a hermeneutics of Cash. It's an interpretation of him, and people can disagree with it. And some people who didn't like the book, you know, disagreed with how I framed him.
Yeah, but the Cash fundamentalists. There is only one true interpretation.
I do think there are people that saw him as, you know, maybe more right-coded politically. But I think he resisted a lot of that.
I do too.
You know, in certain kinds of ways. But he's a, I think it was truthful to Cash. I think people know Cash and read it. And I've encountered a few people that kind of knew him personally. That's been fun to go to places and speak about Cash and encounter people that like knew him. Like I've been in Arkansas, and people that knew him have come up and they've appreciated the book and felt it was like true to the person that they like they knew. Yeah.
Man, that's great. It's an aspiration to just someday dive into something I love so much that I end up writing a book about it that's not in my field. You know what I mean? Like, that just seems like
well, you're at a school where that's possible, right? I paved the way, right?
Yeah, you know? Absolutely. So yeah, I'll just point over at the psych department.
We can be a little bit more eclectic in what we pursue. Yeah,
that's great. That is great. Okay, so prison ministry. That was on my list of topics because I got to do that for the last few years in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, and wasn't anything I ever expected to get into. I mean, that was something that I knew you had done because I followed your blog and so on, and admired that, but it wasn't on my radar. And circumstantially, we just got led into that as a congregation, and I was one of the people that started going in regularly, and I have my own reflections on what all of that means for me, but I'm curious what have been some of your takeaways from the experience. Again, this is sort of as theological data. What is the experience of reading the Bible with inmates done for you theologically?
Yeah. So as I was describing, you know, I really did go out there, looking for God. I didn't go out there. I think a lot of people who are my liberal friends thought I went out there because I was concerned about mass incarceration. They saw it as a social justice move.
Okay.
And it wasn't. It wasn't. I mean, to be clear, I'm concerned about all those kinds of things.
Yeah,
But I went out there because I felt like, and I feel like even strongly today, that the gospel just sounds different when it's read on the margins. I think I think the New Testament was written in a socially marginalized context.
Yeah.
It resonates in a way that it doesn't resonate anywhere else on the margins, and Christianity flourishes still to this day globally on the margins. I think the Bible is best read as resistance literature, and sometimes you don't get that in privileged elite middle class spaces where you and I tend to live, because the atmosphere in those spaces is twofold. One, because of our economic buffering from the ups and downs of life. There is a sense of contentment that the gospel can be kind of optional. Like, I can do it or not do it. It doesn't really matter because I have fulfilling work. I have interesting hobbies. I'm looking forward to my vacation time. You know what I mean? Like it can be, and I think that's why Jesus says it's hard for a rich person to get into heaven, because they're kind of insulated from the existential crisis of their lives. Yep. They can hide from it. But the other part, so that's just the economic location. But the university space in our church, as you know, has a lot of university people in it. Is that critical apparatus that you're constantly trained in? And you know this better than anybody. You know the constant joke about the quickest way to lose your faith is go to seminary. And I think the reason for that is because you're trained in a critical approach. You know, and once you're formed, because there's a kind of a spiritual formation that occurs. Once that critical apparatus is in your head, and you're always kind of surgically dissecting Bible classes, sermons. Once you get a master's degree, you can no longer sing a worship song. Because you're evaluating the lyrics, and that just puts you at a critical distance with faith, and that's unhealthy too. And that's where I was. Okay. And I'm also prone to that anyway intellectually. Like I'm prone to pick at things and analyze them. And so what was good for me about prison ministry was being in a place where that marginalized context, where the gospel was a matter of life and death. Like it was literally like, and so my critical deconstructing misgivings, like, is any of this true? Right. Let's keep it all at a distance. Let's not get caught up into the naivete of strong belief or whatever. Then you get out there, you quickly realize that they're like, well, what are you doing out here? Like if you don't like this has to be real. This has to be true. And that was a bracing experience for me. And so the story I tell, and you might have heard me tell this before, but early on in my time out there, I was trying to think of what a series to do. And I'm trying to put my mind in the place of the prisoners. And I'm thinking like, oh, you know what? They're probably dealing with like a lot of desolation. Where is God? I will do a series on the Psalms of Lament, because I figured that would speak into their desolations. So I get out there and I'm going through the Psalms of Lament, and they're looking at me like, and they stop me and they go like, whoa, like, we get it.
Yeah,
prison is awful.
Yeah,
we don't need
have to tell us.
Yeah, and I was like, oh, that's a good point.
Yeah,
and I said, so what do you need to hear? And they said, hope. And again, as a winter Christian, I was like, well, I don't really do hope. I mean, I haven't felt hopeful in 20 years, like hope. And I kind of realized like, oh, okay. So like, yeah, hope, like this is real. This is, Easter has changed the world. And so they like forced me into Reconstruction.
Yeah.
And so to me, that was what was faith saving about being in those contexts. And I think that's why the gospel thrives in marginalized contexts, because people come to the end of themselves. And the question of faith is it's not a lifestyle choice. It's not a leisure activity. That's the trouble with like middle class churches, right? The gospel church, it's a leisure activity. You know, it's good. It's good, healthy involvement for the family, but it's not a matter of like desperation.
Yeah.
And I think I needed to get around desperate people
Yeah.
to realize my own desperation.
Yeah.
That I think I had hidden from under a layer of intellectual sophistication, if I could put it that way.
Yeah, that's so good. There's no reason you would be aware of this, but my specific niche in scholarship is hermeneutics, more specifically missional hermeneutics, more specifically, and like the argument that I've been working on for years is, if I boil it down, is it matters very much where we read and who we read with. Right. I mean, this is hermeneutically foundational in a way that is almost always overlooked in at least Western Christianity.
Yeah.
And in fact, I think one of the earliest people to make a compelling argument about that was Bob Ekblad in Reading with the Damned.
I know Bob. I met Bob.
Yeah. And and there's just something about that experience of reading with incarcerated people. Well, it puts you in contact with Luke 4:18. I mean, it's who are the captives that are going to be set free. And it's the same thing as reading with the poor and reading with the sick, and it's that desperation. I mean, it's that absolute need that ought to shape far more. I mean, I would go so far as to say all, but it certainly ought to have way more traction in academic theology, right? To recognize that almost everybody doing that kind of work is in a position of privilege socially that puts them out of touch with the reality to which the gospel is addressed, because it's not simply addressed to your sort of middle class guilt before a disapproving God. And so I am just right there with you, and both the experience of reading with the guys inside and reading with homeless people, with impoverished people, has been vital for my own not only faith but understanding of what we're even doing with Scripture. Amen.
I was, over the years, I was struck because it was almost I was living through like speaking to this issue of social location, where the gospel, who you're reading it with or not. Like for almost 20 years now, I've been living like a sociological experiment, because as you know, I teach an adult faith Bible class at church with. And that class has historically attracted kind of the more intellectual crowd. And I would do that on Sunday morning, okay? And then my Bible studies at the prisons on Monday night. And so like the very next day,
oh, wow.
I am, so like literally side by side.
Yeah.
One thing would be like problematic, and I'm tiptoeing around the objections. And then the other night, I'm reading the exact same thing, and they're just like, "Yeah, that's right."
Yeah.
I'm like, and like for almost 2 decades, just literally side by side, what the gospel sounds like here and here, and it caused me in my own journey toward Reconstruction to like rehabilitate doctrines I have found historically problematic. So one of the and because of that, because of my reconstructing, I've said some things that I think have alarmed. I think early on when people joined my writing, I was more on that kind of deconstructing. It's what attracted Rachel Held Evans to my writing.
Yeah,
was because I was a part of that early phase. But then after prison ministry, that changed, and I started writing things that became alarming to the audience I'd attracted that was from the left and progressive side. Began being alarmed because I began defending doctrines that typically are pinatas on the progressive. Like, so for example, penal substitutionary atonement. Like,
Right.
as a progressive kind of person, like, that's not my preferred framework. I'm more of a kind of a Christus Victor guy. That said, again, this goes back to our conversation about guilt.
Yeah.
You know, the leading edge of the gospel is like your guilt. And I get it. Like making 13-year-olds feel like they're going to hell is probably not pastorally wise. That kind of revivalistic, altar call kind of way of approaching
Sinners in the
good
hands of
news.
an angry God, right?
Yeah,
Right.
I get that. But so I had most of my early writing was like just, you know, penal substitutionary atonement's the worst. It's but then you go out social location, you go out to a maximum security prison, and the issue of guilt is their pressing pastoral question.
And the
Can I
penal
be-
framework is front and center.
Yeah, exactly. Can I be forgiven? Am I forgiven for what I have done?
Yeah.
And suddenly you realize, like, oh, grace, mercy, forgiveness is good news.
Yeah.
You know, now I get it. Should we make people feel guilty and horrible, a sinful worm, to get to that message? No, like, no, we should not instill guilt
Yeah.
to then alleviate people from that guilt.
Right.
But to act as if people don't carry guilt is ridiculous. You know? And that's one of the reasons why I don't really identify as being a progressive anymore. Because if you go progressive spaces, like, the idea of mercy is problematic. You know, back to your point about, like, if nobody feels any sin anymore, you know, like literally the idea of grace is problematic.
Yeah, why do you
because
need it?
grace presumes mercy and forgiveness. And I'm like, really? You're trying to tell me people aren't haunted by their sin, that they haven't broken things in their relationships or done things that they just are nagged by that, like, and that the gospel doesn't come into that haunted space in your mind and say you can let that burden down, you're forgiven.
Yeah.
I mean, like, how did progressives like talk themselves out of something so essential to not only the gospel but the human experience?
Yeah.
And anyway, but it took prison ministry to get me to see that. Like,
Yeah.
like I had talked myself out of any forensic illusion, and then until you face it clearly like that, you're like, oh, here's another one. Like how heaven has become problematic in progressive spaces. Like there was such a concern to make the gospel relevant that the kingdom was defined wholly in political terms,
Fully imminent,
social
yeah,
justice
yeah.
terms. And the idea of heaven became problematic. And I blame N.T. Wright for this. That book he wrote, Surprised by Hope. Like, pastors read that for a generation and go like, let's stop talking about heaven and talk about, you know, this. And I get it. It's in the Lord's Prayer. Kingdom come on earth. But, and so songs like, this is a classic example, like song like I'll Fly Away, old gospel hymn, right? Was, you know, exhibit A of an over-realized eschatology, you know, that it was not about this earth, but flying away and escaping this earth, you know. And so what a horrible song, you know.
Yeah.
And then, but guess what? Guess what their favorite song is out at the prison? I'll Fly Away. And because of verse 2 of I'll Fly Away, like a bird from prison bars has flown. I'll fly away. Like, it's in a prison.
Escape is a pretty good idea.
In a prison, it's like, yeah, like emancipation, liberation, you know, and
And that can't be, for them, that can't be literal. Because, I mean, what is the progressive, including me? I mean, who's going to say this? What are they going to say? Well, they're going to say, yeah, that it should be about liberation from an actual incarceration, right?
Except if you have a life sentence.
But they can't, right? That's the point. So what else is left?
What are they looking forward to?
Right. Exactly. There is a future freedom that has nothing to do with the literal incarceration.
And here's the thing is, it's only with that eschatological horizon that like things like Revelation make any sense. Like you can't. So it's Oedipal. People were raised with an over-realized, overly triumphalistic eschatology, and they swung so far toward the social justice side that they lost track of. But they have an under-realized eschatology, a defeatist eschatology that if you've ever spent time if you think about the Black church experience in America, or you think about the faith on the margins,
come from? Yeah.
They come from people that are like, listen, I might not see
freedom ever,
but I have a hope one day. And again, I want to be clear. There's a dialectic there between, in the great by and by versus social justice now, and I think we live in between those times.
Yeah. I mean, the overcorrection isn't overcorrection. It's not that there isn't a need for a correction, and I think that there is a massive, especially in those bougie church spaces that have managed to be so escapist in their theology because there's nothing they need actually to escape from presently. And so, I mean, I think the correction's right. And to be fair to dear brother Wright, I take that to be a misuse of the argument that he's making, which is a corrective, not an overcorrection. But
I love Wright, but I'm just talking about like
the use matters. That what you make.
I saw a generation of preachers read that book. This is what I think. This is my diagnosis of what happened. Is like I think preachers were dealing with the new atheist movement, and faith was getting very hard and thin. And I think this is also what has happened in the humanities in colleges. Is like, how do you make the gospel practical? How do you make it relevant? Like, how do you make an English class relevant? Well, make it political, right? Make it political. And so suddenly an English class is relevant because, it's about critical theory and make it relevant. And I'm not saying critical theory is bad. I'm just saying that was a way the humanities said, here's why humanities matter.
Right.
It's because it's about politics. And I think preachers of a certain generation did a similar thing. Yeah. How do I make the gospel relevant? Social justice, right? Yeah. Social justice. And again, the gospel is about social justice, to be clear. And I think Wright's book was helped them make that argument, right? The kingdom is here, and it's not escaping. And I agree with all that. I want to agree with all that. But I feel like, again, it was an Oedipal swing.
Too much already, not enough, not yet.
And then and that we lost a capacity for a conversation about hope and heaven and all of those kinds of things. Like, I don't know the last time, I've heard a sermon about heaven. And in a similar way that when was the last time we heard a sermon about sin? I think it's all of a piece there that has happened.
Well, and that's one of the things that I learned from Wright, right? Because my just to use the same word, deconstruction of the penal substitutionary atonement model was fully academic. I mean, it was that critical mode in which it couldn't withstand the exegesis of the text. But one of the things I learned from Wright, especially in his to and fro with John Piper, was that he was like, guilt is a part of the gospel, and penal substitutionary atonement as a theological model is a contextualization of the gospel in a time and place. It's not the whole gospel, right? And part of the reason, to go back to what you were saying about the difficulty of being theologically trained, is that it's always about the absence of nuance. I mean, that's what becomes so frustrating. Whether it's one end of the spectrum or the other, wherever the pendulum has swung to, you're always sitting there going like, yeah, but that's not the whole story. Why are we reducing this to the one thing? And that's kind of still where I am on that. You know, I think it's a terribly inadequate model by itself, but more importantly, the gospel is so multifaceted and salvation is so incredibly all-encompassing biblically that it's a real shame to reduce it to one thing or the other. I find it useful to contextualize the gospel, and when you're in a context where penal substitution is significant, that's what you should do. You should foreground that dimension of the message, and that just makes pretty straightforward sense to me as a missiologist. Get to claim that title in some sense, and that's why I struggle with the debate and the conversation sometimes. It's like, guys, wow.
Well, it's similar to what we were talking about with purity culture, right? Like, in one sense, like we said, if by purity culture you mean the traditional Christian sexual ethic, then everything is purity culture.
Right.
In a similar way with penal substitutionary atonement, like if you think that salvation has something to do with mercy or grace, then that's just the truth. I mean, that's just, if you want to call that penal substitution, whatever. Like, but the fact that our sins are not held against us, right? As far as the East is from the West.
The cross addresses sin and guilt. Sure.
So in one sense, you're like, everything is penal substitutionary atonement. I mean, we stand forgiven. When we get to heaven, all the bad things I've done are not going to be counted against me. You know what I mean? So in one sense, it's just in the ambient atmosphere, right? So the problem is, like with purity culture, is like it's when you start making people feel contaminated, and then you're trying to instill a shame because of their sexual behavior, or scare them into so you're leveraging fear and shame to control behavior. In a similar way, penal substitutionary atonement, of course, mercy and grace. Everybody believes that. But it's when you, as a preacher, or on a Saturday night at the campground, you're making the kids gather around the campfire, and you're trying to instill guilt into people and make them feel afraid. Then you're starting to get into like pastoral malpractice, And
that's what it is. So much of it is spiritual leadership doing abusive things, doing manipulative things, right? It's not even about the ethic itself in that particular case, or the doctrine itself in the other case. It's not about the content of the claim. It's how it's being weaponized, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. So in one sense, at the background level, none of these theologies are particularly problematic.
Right.
It's when they are then, weaponized is a good word there. A lighter word would be instrumentalized. I'm going to turn it into a tool to get an altar call, or, but that continuum from instrumentalized to weaponized is when you start. People are now being manipulated rather than experiencing good news. They're being. God is being used to manipulate them for some ulterior goal. Is where mostly you see that problem.
Yeah, Well, which goes to, like, how do you address that? Well, you're talking about the spiritual formation of the people with the microphone, right? I mean, that the fundamental issue, which I don't see deconstruction actually addressing much. Is like, what's the struggle here? Well, it's actually the underdevelopment of the people who are in charge in some way. And
all the incentives. I mean, all the incentives of ministry, lead towards kind of like tempt toward control, right? Like money, contribution, people in the pews, you know, like the metrics of success are not tempting you towards leading you towards like just healthy pastoral care of a church, even if it's declining or diminishing. You know what I mean? Like that's why I like Eugene Peterson's book, The Pastor. And his just kind of like, listen, my job is to marry and bury these people. You know, I'm just going to walk alongside them as a shepherd. I'm not trying to increase revenues or get a book deal or turn this church into a self-esteem project, because that's so if you get an unhealthy pastor in a very entrepreneurial church growth experience, then that's where that theology would then become used as a tool by the unhealthy pastor to get the people to help him meet his metrics of success.
That's right. Yeah. I've called out the utilitarianism, particularly, you know, in my corner of the academy, the utilitarianism of kind of the church growth mentality, the people movement approaches to things. It's all of the same fabric, right? There's a well-known Peruvian missiologist that kind of called this out in the 90s. He referred to it as managerial missiology, where you're just trying to pull these levers and push these buttons to get particular results, and that ethos is so deadly. It has created all kinds of problems, and I don't think people recognize how much of that stands behind the cultural movement that we're labeling deconstruction. It's so much about those kinds of underlying commitments and motives, that there's a sense in which you're not only missing the mark in the deconstruction conversation often, but actually creating a whole bunch of other problems that aren't it's by not addressing what's really going on there. Well, okay, so to continue the Reconstruction conversation and name a couple of other maybe doctrines or things that seem to have come to the surface for you through this experience. I know one I heard you say specifically, I don't know if you remember the rooftop homebrewed Christianity podcast thing you did with N.T. Wright, responding to Reviving Old Scratch.
And Greg
Malibu.
Boyd.
Yeah, and Greg Boyd. I was there. Megan and I were there.
Oh, you were on that rooftop?
Yeah, we were on that rooftop. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, sitting with the.
That was such a crazy experience.
Yeah, that was really interesting. That was pretty cool. But I remember you saying in that conversation specifically that sort of recovering the doctrine of Satan was motivated by the prison experience and just being with people who have absolutely no doubt. And so I was there for that before I went into the prison system and had the exact same experience where I had already, because of relationships, friendships with charismatics, I had already sort of started exploring, like, what are you guys perceiving here that I'm not perceiving? But then going in and just having these conversations with guys, we're like, okay, what do we need to pray about today? And these are people who, most of them are not raised in church people. I mean, they were not, they're reading the Bible for the first time. They're not religious. They're looking for something. And it's like their prayer requests are like, man, it's really dark on the pod today. Like there's something in the air. There's something going on. We need to pray about that. And it's like, okay, you're identifying like spiritual realm dynamics with no paradigm for what that is. Yeah. And so say something about how that went in your experience.
Yeah, because that became my very first popular book. Like when I was describing earlier my pivot to popular writing, and the publisher said like, hey, have you? And again, I'm pretty early on in my prison ministry, and he's like, like, what would be that book, a popular level book? And I go like, well, I kind of want to write a book about the devil, you know? And he's like, okay, tell me more about that. And I was like, well, again, you know, given where I was in my journey, I'm on that kind of deconstructed, like I definitely, again, progressives believe in evil, right? But it's mainly social justice, oppression, right? So laying on top of that any sort of supernatural, occult,
Right.
you know, metaphysical evil is really unnecessary, right? Because there's plenty of evil to deal with in the world.
Right.
We don't need to conjure up a guy with horns and a pitchfork.
Right.
So it wasn't so much that like an act of disbelief. It was just like not really necessary. Like I got plenty to occupy myself in fighting for justice, you know? And if you want to use the word Satan to describe oppression, then fine. We can lay a mythological language on top of it. But at the end of the day, I'm still fighting for justice.
Sort of the Walter Wink powers and principalities. Is
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. But then you get out in the prison and these guys are articulating a lived experience with presences and powers. And I didn't want to be, and this is the irony of progressive theology, I didn't want to be paternalistic.
Tell them that's not real.
Yeah. And go like, well, guys, like people with master's degrees and PhDs don't believe in this stuff.
Yeah.
You know, like educated people don't believe this stuff. So I didn't want to like pat them on the head, but neither did I want to pretend. Go like, yeah, okay, I'll pretend along with you. I will keep my doubts to myself and just go along, because that felt false to me as well. So I found myself in that in between place, and so I wrote the book to just bridge the to borrow from like the enchanted, disenchanted language from Charles Taylor. Like I was trying to bridge from a disenchanted view of evil to a more enchanted view of evil. And if you look at Scripture, there's plenty to camp out on, because typically the way we perceive that is there's just injustice, a completely disenchanted view of evil. It's just humans behaving badly. I called it in the book the scuba dooification of the devil. And so like in a Scooby-Doo episode, old school Scooby-Doo.
Pull the mask off. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Early on, it's enchanted. There's a ghost, right? A spooky monster. Evil is enchanted. But by the end of it, it's disenchanted. It's just bad people doing bad things. And that's the Scooby-Dooification of the devil that you see a lot in progressive spaces. Like it's just, you don't need the spooky stuff. It's just bad people doing bad things. Well, but then the other side, the enchanted view, is like The Exorcist. It's very florid depictions of demonic possession, or people being possessed and becoming like killers. But again, that's not in the Bible either. Like if you look at the people afflicted by unclean spirits in Scripture, they're not killers. You know, they weren't in
self-harm,
they
disease. Yeah.
And you can disenchant that. You can say, well, that's just ancient descriptions of mental illness or something like that. And I'm not saying that. I'm just saying the spiritual possessions, they were soothsayers or fortune tellers or just crazy and hurt themselves. They weren't evil in the way Hollywood portrays a demonic possession. The guy with Legion demons or Mary Magdalene weren't stabbing people.
Right.
You know, like so the point being is like a biblical approach to the devil is going to be very illuminating for both sides of that conversation. The disenchanted and the occult person who has a very kind of both are very unbiblical. So I wrote that book to try to help me bridge that divide. But that's another great location, like where you see that. We talk about heaven. There's also that whole idea about the demonic and spiritual warfare. And again, that book, probably of all my books, that one got the most pushback.
Yeah.
Because at that point, I've been kind of like walking that disenchanted progressive line, and then came out with a book about the devil. And because of that Oedipal reaction, people like who had come out of like charismatic spaces were alarmed that I was rehabilitating something that they were trying to get away from.
Right.
But the other thing I would say at that time about the disenchantment is like, I think a lot of like educated white pastors and theologians, because of the echo chambers of conversation, forget that most people are supernaturalists.
Yeah.
That skepticism about the devil is really niche. It's like most people believe in ghosts and karma and demonic forces and angels. I mean, like, just walk into any bookstore and go to like the metaphysical New Age section or watch Hollywood movies. Like, so this idea about like, is the devil real? That's not the main. And as you know, as a missiologist, go to the global
No, there's
church.
just no question. Yeah.
And it tends to be a really kind of thing that I think kind of like, so I think a lot of white pastors get kind of tangled up in kind of like their little echo chamber of seminary education, and they deconstruct, and they're like, does anybody believe in any of this? Like, listen, you can talk about angels, guardian angels, and most of your church would be like, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
But the reason they don't do it is because they have all their pastor buddies watching their sermons, and they're like, look, Joe's preaching about angels? You know what I mean? Like, it looks unsophisticated.
Yeah.
And so sometimes I think pastors have like tricked themselves out of being more robustly metaphysical.
That's right.
And could dare to be a little bit more weird.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. If you go quiet about all that stuff, our young people are running towards that kind of stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Like, our young people are seeing auras. They're dabbling in manifest, like witchcraft light. They might not do a hex, but they'll manifest things. I mean, if you don't talk about the supernatural, that void is going to get filled.
Yeah.
And is being filled currently. And if you're constantly worrying about the atheists on Reddit,
Yeah.
and not the young witches on TikTok, you are that is pastoral negligence from the pulpit.
Yep.
And so I think you could dare to be a little bit more weird and supernatural than what we currently do from our pulpit, because we're so worried about getting criticized as being unintellectual. And I think it's like, you're right. I think it's a Western thing.
Yeah.
Go to Asia, go to China, go to South America. Very haunted.
Yeah, but yeah, exactly. But I think you're right. It's not even actually a Western thing, if it ever was. But anymore, it's not. And this is a really interesting turn. I talked with Lauren White about this back on an earlier episode quite a bit. But all of the evidence, like what you're talking about with students, like on a much broader cultural scale, is that at the grassroots level, the phenomena of spirituality are evident to people. And so in missiology back in the 80s, a prominent missiologist named Paul Hebert sort of put his finger on what he called the excluded middle. He was formerly a mathematician, so he was sort of porting over terminology, but that Western missionaries going to these other cultures basically fail to contextualize the gospel because of the excluded middle. They've got the earthly stuff and the up in heaven stuff, but none of the connective tissue that is demons and angels and all of that, the spiritual realm. And so a lot of us took that to heart. But at this point, I think it's necessary to say that's also true in the West. Like the notion that there is an excluded middle in the West is almost it's an Enlightenment myth. That there may have been a moment in the late 1800s where on a widespread scale culturally, there was this kind of scientific sophistication in the air where people. I just don't see it anymore. In fact, it's weirdly that perception is surviving more in churches than on the street. And that's backwards. I mean, that's really strange. And as you say, lean in, go for weird, or I tend to think of it as just go for orthodoxy. Like there's a whole lot about our confession and our text that just tells us, like, stand on this. This is where we are with our vision of the world. And
if you articulate it, if you have confidence in it, it'll resonate. Yeah. It always has, it always will, because it's us talking ourselves out of or being embarrassed by. Like, who cares what Sam Harris thinks?
Yeah, that's right.
Who cares what Alex O'Connor thinks?
Yeah.
Like stop watching them. There's other things going on amongst your people that they're supernaturalists. Don't worry about the cultural despiser anymore and trying to woo them. Just preach the gospel.
Yeah. So was hunting magic eels an extension of reviving Old Scratch in that sense, like just leaning more into reenchantment?
Yeah. So if hunting, if reviving Old Scratch was like a specific kind of enchantment, like what does it mean to kind of re-enchant, reconstruct this conversation about the devil? What would hunting magic eels is kind of maybe reconstructing, re-enchanting just God, so it's more broadly about the Christian faith in a broad conversation about enchantment rather than a specific kind of thing. And that was catching a wave. A lot of books about enchantment that kind of became a big thing and still is kind of a big thing. And so it's just my contribution to that kind of that conversation. Again, a little different, like Rod Dreher's book, like Living in Wonder, is an example of that kind of thing. And I had a conversation with Brad East, a colleague of ours, about the difference between those approaches. Because Rod Dreher he does really lean into the very supernaturalist kind of storytelling. And my take on it is a little bit more it's less about occult storytelling than talking about like habits of attention. Yeah. And the way we can make ourselves increasingly available to the inbreaking of God in our lives.
Yes.
So a little different approach,
which I love. I mean, I appreciate the distinction that you're drawing there, because there is more than one bailiwick here in this conversation. But again, for my sort of missional hermeneutics approach, that attentiveness is so critical in the practice of discernment, communal discernment, understanding what God is up to, or the inverse, what's going on, what is happening around us in spiritual terms, in the prison, in the homeless encampment. Right? There's more things happening than just the injustice or the poverty or the lack or whatever. And so I really like that, and I'll just make this my last question and let you get on with your day. But I was reading your recent posts on intentionality, and I got kind of nervous because that word is really central in my vocabulary, especially doing discipleship. My friends can tell you they're at the eye roll point with me saying the word intentionality.
Yeah.
And so you sort of cracking open, like, is there a problem with this? Should we be cautious about this? So what should I avoid with intentionality?
Well, you'll like where the series ends. So the series is kind of, again, to bring up Brad again. We need to tell Brad to listen to this podcast.
Maybe I can get him on here. He's so tech averse. I don't know if he'll agree, but maybe.
He's doing podcasts now because he's got to promote his stuff.
Okay.
And but Brad wrote an essay, Christianity Today, and I think it was in response to John Mark Comer's book, his last one, Practicing the Way. I think it was, but basically it was kind of like intentionality being a bad thing. And so to kind of cut to the chase, I'm with you. Like, like my first post in that series was like, in all my books, I've made a point about intentionality being good. But the post you had just read was me kind of doing due diligence for Brad's side. And I think I have another post coming out that's going to at least raise Brad's concern. And his concern is, because he's a big tradition guy, is that because of, this kind of comes back to the enchantment, disenchantment stuff, Charles Taylor's The Secular Age, because the conditions of belief have changed and that faith is now less a cultural given, that a tradition I step into. It's now something I have to choose and invent and select. That modernity has undermined faith, and so Brad was basically in his argument about intentionality saying that the sickness is deeper. It's that we need to we don't need to invent this. We just gotta, because he's big on tradition. And the idea is like, I just submit to the tradition, Right. And I agree with his concerns. I agree that faith is more fragile and effortful, and it's like so. I am trying to steel man his argument rather than straw man. So there's a couple of posts where I'm like, listen, I get it. Like, I understand that in a world of radical choice and decision, intentionality is maybe the only recommendation we have, but in many ways it is building upon a prior sickness of modernity, that it's all the individual will and self-authorship. Yeah. And I get it, but as you'll see as I finish the series, I come back to this point basically saying, like, the genie can't be put back in the bottle.
Yes, that's one of the things I was going to say.
Yeah. The second thing I say is like, and this is where I think Brad suffers from his own Oedipal issues, is because he started in low church Protestantism and embraced the tradition as he went through his training. But people that are cradle Catholics and, from the Orthodox, like, tradition is no safe harbor from the intentionality you're calling us towards, right? Yeah. Like if you sat down with a local Catholic priest and go like, hey, what's your number one pastoral problem with your people? He'd probably say intentionality. He'd probably say they're not coming to confession. They're not doing holy days of obligation. When they're here, they're checked out. Like, he's going to, like, it's not like Catholicism is some sort of harbor from being lukewarm or, so that's the other thing I say in the thing. Genie can't be put back in the bottle. Tradition does not save you from needing to be invested, intentional, showing up. You're right. Brad's right. Like, you don't have to go through sort of hermeneutical churn at your church. Like our church went through a hermeneutical thing about gender roles. Like, I get that. You're spared all of that. But I make this point in my series is like, well, how did the conservative Catholics respond to the pontificate of Francis? Like, they're not spared churn and distress and crises of conscience just because they're Catholic. Like, they're still figuring out what Vatican II really means. Yep. Like the idea that somehow you can going to step into this beautiful liturgy and just lean back and just rest and don't have to involve your will, right, or your intention, I don't think is accurate description of what's going on in those churches. Yeah. And then the final thing I say is the last post, so now you don't have to read them, is the new normal, religious pluralism, swimming against the tide, was the old normal. Yep. If you just look at the imperatives of Scripture as they were living as a minority culture, it was like, be intentional, right? Be transformed. Do not participate in the world. Like our minority status against a very pluralistic pagan backdrop. This is This has always been the way of the Christian, is an intentional swimming against the stream. Do not be conformed. If that's not an appeal to intentionality, I don't know what is.
Right.
So I get his concern about decision fatigue. If we're constantly being intentional, there's a decision fatigue. And
Sure.
I get that. But that's why the scripture talks about endurance and perseverance. You know, I get it. There's an issue there. And a virtue needs to be formed where the intentionality becomes more habitual.
Yeah.
So you're right. So that's another piece I can say here is that, yes, intentionality must give way to virtue, but virtue is not formed without intentionality.
Right. Well, I think part of the presumption here that I question is there's sort of a Jamie Smith cultural liturgies presumption that it's not even really actually intentionality that's forming virtue or pushing some of the conscious stuff back into the background. Because I thought one of the things that you pointed out about how much has become a question of conscious decision culturally, it's very different from the way that it used to be. I think that's an interesting insight. I'm not sure how accurate it is actually from a cultural analytic perspective, and I'm not sure that I think the notion of the cultural liturgy forming you. In other words, the tradition is doing the work. You're not even having to be intentional about it as long as you sort of give yourself over to the liturgical tradition and the ecclesial formation that's going to happen to you, and so it just is, and now it's operating in the background, and that's like a significant, and people have recognized that's a significant thing to sort of spell out and recommend. And it's not everything. It is in terms of the way that worldview actually functions. The tradition has never ever functioned apart from other worldview assumptions.
Yeah.
And so okay, we're talking about a different set of worldview assumptions and a rearrangement of some things that maybe used to be in the background that are now in the foreground, and vice versa. I mean, that's what's, I think, sort of missing here. And the intentionality is necessary always because you have to make choices in the midst of the cultural pressure that exists, whatever that pressure is. And all I can say from an on-the-ground pastoral experience is, yeah, there can be something like decision fatigue when you talk about intentionality a lot. It should never be all that you're talking about. But the need to talk about it is because the alternative isn't some intentionality that doesn't lead to fatigue. It's rather, in my experience, no intentionality whatsoever. No awareness of the need to sort of plug into this and think about what we're doing and make some choices, say yes, say no. And that just leaves me with like a pragmatic sort of, this is what it is, and the church needs to be more intentional than it actually is. Letting the tradition just do its thing to us is not a sufficient response.
Well, I think, to go back to James Smith stuff, like if you read his books, like your big recommendation, like if you kind of look as You Are What You Love, Desiring the Kingdom, is like his big recommendation is like liturgy, like become become Episcopalian, right? And again, that's exactly what an ex-evangelical like Smith would say, right? Like nobody loves the liturgy more than Protestants who become Episcopalian, Catholic, or Orthodox. Yeah. Right? They're like, liturgy is the silver bullet.
Yep.
And it's only an Oedipal reaction because you love it. But again, liturgy without intentionality doesn't form you.
Yeah.
I say this in my series, and this is, again, this is probably a very extreme thing to say, but just think about the Catholic sexual abuse crisis, right?
Yeah.
You have pedophiles presiding over the liturgy, okay? So The liturgy, the Catholic liturgy is a sacramental wonder, but that liturgy without intentionality doesn't form you.
That's right.
It's beautiful. So you got to show up with an open heart and with intentionality and invest in it and let it shape you. And if you don't have that, then and
Well,
so
and,
to
yeah,
me,
and I would say it forms you, but only so far. Like I would say, it's not doing nothing, but it's not the silver bullet, as you say. I mean, it's
yeah, and that's where I started pushing back on a lot of evangelicals saying, you know, we need, make church better, better liturgy. We need to pass the peace. We need to,
Yeah.
And I'm like, listen, I'm a liturgical snob. Like, I was upset that we took down our Christmas trees on Epiphany last Sunday. Like, I was grumpy about that. Like, I am a liturgy nerd. But I don't think having Christmas trees up all the way through Epiphany is somehow going to form the fruits of the Spirit in us.
Yeah.
I think it gives us a better shot at it. It claws back secular time for the church. I like keeping time. Mm-hmm. I like the church to keep time, not the world. It's a little thing, but I'm not convinced that the tradition or the liturgy can do anything without the intentionality of the human heart. So I agree with you. We agree.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Well, good. I mean, again, I do appreciate sort of pointing out what all is entailed with the. I wasn't aware of the New York Times piece and sort of pointing out the overabundance of intentionality language. Because again, my experience in my little echo chamber, it was like talking in those terms is like, what are you even saying? What is that?
Yeah.
Why? And so it's interesting that on a broader level, there seems to be a lot of that kind of language. And it's useful to point out the entailments, which are worthy of consideration if we are actually going to contextualize. But I just don't see an alternative, man. I don't.
I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Richard, thank you for taking the time. It's been a delight to kind of walk through your journey and your books, and I very much appreciate the conversation.
Oh, it was great great being on it, Craig.
Well,
ask again sometime.
Yeah. Okay. Well, then I will. Well, have a great day, and we'll talk soon.
All right. We'll see you later.